The Samaritans. They were a small people group mentioned by Jesus and recorded by Luke and John in their writings only 6 times. But what is significant is Jesus, a Jew, refers to them favourably at a time when his culture despised them. His referring to these people in the way that he did not go down well with the Jews, who held the Samaritans in contempt. They showed their disfavour by saying to Jesus, "We were right all along. You are a Samaritan dog." Sort of a 12-gauge double whammy insult. Insults aside, the Samaritans were once Jews. That is, until they clearly had enough of King Solomon's disastrous taxation, and faced with a new king intent on upping the ante on the intolerable burden on the 12 tribes, they up and left, or 10 of the tribes at least. Most of these people faded away into oblivion. They became known as the lost tribes of Israel. Means pretty much the same thing. Well, not all of them, for some managed to avoid getting carted off to Assyria, and they became known not by their tribe, but by where they lived, Samaria. They lost their tribal identity when they intermarried with the surrounding people and worshipped their gods. They didn't forget God, however, for when a bunch of lions went on the rampage, they believed it was punishment from God, so they started looking frantically for the law so they would know what to do. That is, before the lions ate them all. Nobody had a copy, so they called on the Assyrians to send down a priest with a copy of the law and fast. Perhaps a chariot load of shotguns would have been better value, for the priest that was sent down knew a lot about false gods, but little about the one true God. But he did bring a copy of the law, missing lots of pages, but enough to get the lions sorted, it seems. The Samaritans read that law and found that a Messiah would come and restore the kingdom to Israel, or what was left of it, the ones that hadn't got lost or eaten. They liked the delivering and the restoring idea, but they didn't have any time for the kingdom bit. They were a mixed race people that had given up on kings and any notion of kingdom. They just wanted to feel that they still had some rating with God, even though his so-called chosen people hated them and treated them as vermin. However, the Messiah did come in the form of a weary, hungry and thirsty man sitting on a well in Samaria, talking to a lone Samaritan woman, another double-barrel insult to a good Jewish man. Quite a conversation too, if not a bit confusing. He talked about something that will happen, future, and already happening, present. He dismissed the idea of her mountain or his mountain, because worshipping the Father, hey, note that word, I bet she hadn't heard that title before, is in spirit and truth, period. She had been waiting for a Messiah and was so convinced that this thirsty Jew was who he said he was, most of the townspeople believed her. The fallen woman had risen. Perhaps the restoring of Israel was going to be one person at a time. The townspeople begged Jesus to go talk to their friends and neighbours. He spent a couple of days there. He talked about being sent from God, his Father no less, and about how the Father was going to sort things out for good between people who don't get along. Well, nobody knows for sure what Jesus said because he didn't write anything down, and neither did they. They got a new law from Jesus. No pages missing, or no pages at all as it turned out. Just as well, because they couldn't read anyway. This new law was written on their hearts. Give love a chance, even towards people who don't like you. Sounds weird, but it made sense to them. What didn't make sense to them was their distant cousins. They didn't believe Jesus was who he said he was, so they killed him. But as it turns out, You can't kill God's son, so he came alive again and showed up to his followers. As far as we know, he didn't get to visit with the Samaritans again, but some men who knew Jesus well, they did, and told them all about his death, burial, and coming alive again. It confirmed what they already believed, that Jesus was who he said he was, that he was the one they knew would come, and that his restoring work is both now and yet to come, setting up a new fatherly king in their lives, a king that gives, not takes, one that loves them as children, not subjects to be ripped off. And best of all, for a people who had lost their tribe, they were outcast and despised, a fatherly king who has no favourites. In a way, these people found something better than a tribe. Tribes have those who are us and those who are not us, those who we like and those who we don't. They abandoned that sort of thinking, and for these people it was easier, for they had lost their tribe years ago. The coming of Jesus had changed their minds, a new mindset, for without tribal thinking they practiced love even toward their enemies. Now they belonged, for they had taken Jesus' message to heart and had a new Father King in their lives. They travelled and they talked about Jesus, and people listened and were intrigued at how they lived and treated everybody. They travelled and they talked, and they found others that they'd met with Jesus too in some way or another. People in Syria, Persia, North Africa, as well as Asia Minor. Now, it may not have been the Samaritans that got to Rome, but as far as we know, the church there was well established before any apostle arrived. In the words of one commentator, it was in a less organised, though far from less flourishing state than other churches. The Apostle Paul wrote to them to get them organised, along understanding salvation by faith and other things, and the letter has become a seminal text in Christian theology, but not to the Roman Church, it seems. What Paul seemed to miss, having never met them, was the way they valued the Spirit over the Word, and had little interest in their vibrant fellowship becoming organised. Prophetic visions were common, as were the visitation of angels. We know this because one of their leaders wrote extensively, and based on the fragments that have been found, his writings were as common as the Gospels. He wrote, "When the angels of the prophetic spirit rests upon that person, he speaks to the whole crowd as the Lord wishes." He goes on to state, the source of visions in the Roman Church was the Spirit, rarely the Scriptures. But in the century that followed, as the canon began to take shape, that changed. It's such a pity the leaders choosing the canon had such an aversion to the work of angels. We are the poorer for it. Instead, as Justin Martyr recorded, the reading of the Scriptures had become central, along with moving the evening meal and fellowship to Sunday morning. That appealed to the elite, but it eliminated the working class who could not afford to lose that work time. Organised and orderly, yes. Organic and vibrant, no. At risk of stating the obvious, we tend not to know much about people we have nothing to do with. So it was with the Jews, the scripture writers, and even the newly minted Christ followers. They still viewed the Samaritans with suspicion and didn't believe that after Jesus rose from the dead, God has no favourites. My claim is that it was the Samaritan Christians that gave the Jesus movement that crucial momentum in the early stages. It flourished, I believe, because it was Jesus that got them started. They weren't distracted by issues driven by that tribal us and them thinking. And they understood that the kingdom that was being restored to God's people, included them, and was in them, sinner by sinner. I also suggest that examining the early church, especially the early years, can provide lessons for our times. And to find these important lessons, we need to do what Jesus did: engage with people and ideas we have had nothing to do with.